The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF.
Glenda, could you talk just a little bit about what you saw this spring as people were putting the crops in the ground, what kinds of things farmers were seeing and should pay attention to?
Sure. Well, some of the conditions we saw this spring were hot and dry conditions. Most of the guys that were seeding their pulses did seem to get those pulses into moisture. They were able to go deep enough to reach that moisture, so that's good. And what we've observed so far is that where the pulses are coming up, we have seen some decent emergence. Some of the things and questions that we've had or inquiries a little bit have been related to heat and hot temperatures. So some fields that are on darker soils and have had a lack of moisture and some warm temperatures have shown a little bit of symptomology of some heat stress, heat canker, and potentially some spotting, possibly due to heat in some cases.
So those are all things that farmers should be looking at as the crop comes out of the ground. When you start scouting crops at this time of the year, what kind of things do you further look for in terms of pests and also possible disease pressure that really shows up?
So some of the things actually producers right now or agronomists could be scouting for weeds, could be scouting for insects, and could be potentially starting to scout for disease symptomology as well. So weed pressure is going to be an important consideration for pulse crops. They are not competitive crops with weeds early on. So if you are finding weeds in the field, it's going to be important to consider some in-crop herbicides if that's an option, and making sure that you're getting those on when the weeds are smaller and there's a lack of crop canopy, so you're getting good penetration to those weeds for coverage. One of the other things to be concerned about, depending on how the environmental conditions, change over the next week or two, if the weeds are sort of slowing in growth due to hot and dry conditions, if we haven't seen that moisture in your area, the weeds may be developing, and the crops, some thicker cuticle, and it may be harder for the herbicide to get to its site of action where it needs to be to work. Due to lack of good growing conditions of those weeds. So to be really aware of that, I think if you're making those in-crop applications, that you're making considerations of time, temperature when you're spraying, water volume, all the things that we can do to really maximize the efficacy of the herbicide that we're applying under stressful conditions.
And that those very early weeds really do make for quite an impact on the crop, I guess, right?
That's right. It's really important to get the weeds out during that critical period where they can have a big influence on yield. And that's one of the factors early on that we can try to control to help maximize yield in our pulse crops. Some of the other things that producers could be scouting for right now are insects, and some of the insects that are being found in the field could be cutworm. We have had reports of some cutworm, a little bit of wireworm, and the other thing that is starting to show up in the odd spot right now is pea leaf weevil. So just really looking for some notches in either faba bean or field pea. Notches in the early leaves where the pea leaf weevil are feeding would be an indicator of that pea leaf weevil being present in the field.
And scouting for cutworms, what kind of scouting can you do for cutworms?
If you're scouting for cutworms, one of the things to look for is plants that have been cut off at the soil surface and or missing. And what you can do there is dig into the soil and look for those cutworms, see what stage they're at. But oftentimes you're really seeing either plants that have been cut off below the soil surface or right at the soil surface. With some of the crops, like peas and lentils, where they have below ground nodes, they actually have a good chance of recovering from some of the above ground clipping from cutworm if it's made above the lower nodes, because the plant can continue to grow from those lower nodes. But if you look at a crop like a soybean, where once it's cut off, then the growing point is above that point of cutoff, you will have lost that plant.
That's a very important distinction for farmers to look at when they're really scouting, to really look at what the plant is and where the damage has been done. What about wireworms in terms of that? Is there something you can do if you have a wireworm infestation?
There's really nothing can do for wireworms at this point. Some of the seed treatments do have a little bit of activity to repel them, but at this point, once the seed's in the ground, there's really not a lot producers can do with wireworm. This year we haven't heard a lot of concerns with wireworm and pulse crops so far.
Okay, excellent. So then the other thing that we're going to start looking for a lot is the weed disease or the diseases. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So if you're scouting for diseases, we recommend particularly for chickpea, but for the pulse crops and soybeans that you are starting to scout fairly early after emergence and prior to early flowering, which is often the time that a fungicide would go on. And what you're basically looking for is disease symptoms. They typically start lower down in the crop canopy, closer to the ground level. So you're looking for symptomology, often spots if it's a foliar type disease on the leaves or the stems where the lesions from the disease are starting to show up. And then you want to evaluate the pressure, the environmental conditions. Is there moisture coming? Is it a thick crop canopy? How much disease lesions you see? Are they moving up the plant? And those types of factors are going to lead you to need to make a decision about whether you want to apply a fungicide.